Okay, so you've transferred your drawing already to your illustration board. I would keep that drawing, the sample drawing before that you transferred. It's a really good practice sheet, so you can practice your techniques on that. When you like it, then you can transfer it over to your final illustration board. So I'm going to talk about a few different techniques today and how you can apply them from your picture to your actual drawing. Now remember, we did our pen and ink techniques earlier. We have stippling, which is dots, hatching, which is just lines, cross hatching, which is lines crisscrossing, and then scribbling. And everyone's scribbling is going to be a little bit different from one another's. Remember, on this you have to have a minimum of 3 different textures. So 3 different techniques. If you have found a technique that works well for you that has not been shown, feel free to do that, but you should have 3 different techniques. The biggest thing I need to talk to you about with this drawing is to keep white areas. Sometime with architecture, we get really caught up in filling everything. But I've kind of identified, like on the window panes here and across and this big pillar, that they're going to stay white. We need that contrast between white and dark to make the picture come alive. So you can see for the hanging plant over here, we've used scribbling, and even with the hanging plant, it looks like it's pretty dark, but I've kept some major white areas on the other side and then made this side really dark so that we have that contrast to make sure that you're seeing it, so it's not just a big dark blob over here. Grass in the back is tiny, tiny little, between stippling and a hatching, so tiny little lines. I can't stress that enough with your architecture drawing. You need to make sure that everything is small. Even if the grass looks like it's large, you don't want to make big, long strokes because it looks like it's scribbling. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to finish up the glass panes here. Notice there's white lines in between, so when I put my crisscross, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to stay away from that line. So I'm going to very carefully outline so I have that white box around this, okay? And then it's going to be a hatching and then a cross hatching over it. I don't necessarily want to fill in the whole thing because it's glass, so there's some reflection. So I put in a few lines one way and a few the other, and then I'll go down to my next box. It's pretty important with architecture that we try to keep our lines as consistent as possible. If you need a ruler to help you with this, we have that in our disposal. So we can go ahead and fill in our next layer. It's kind of random because I don't want them all to look exactly alike, because if I do, then you're not getting that glass glare necessarily. And we definitely want to show that this has that surface area. So this is just one technique of hatching and cross hatching. And I'm leaving some areas dark, putting some areas darker and leaving some areas white. So that's one technique here. The other technique, which is super helpful in architecture, but as we all know, it's very tedious, is the stippling. Windows, I like to do stippling. You can see I've started it here. It helps to make sure you have that glare. If there are dark areas like this, I would not sit and stipple them. I would just color them in, is what I've done already over there. Okay, and making sure to do that. Now, I'm going to start some of this rock wall over here. You can see I've started here. It's very light compared to this, and therefore I want to make sure to keep that light. So this is this area. Notice there's the grout between these is darker, so I can actually put in my lines, whereas the lines here are white, these lines are darker. And then there's some that go straight up and down. Remember to keep your perspective. You took so much time doing your 2-point or 1-point perspective on this that my lines need to stay in perspective, even the grout lines that we did before. Okay, so this is this line. And then you can see over here, I'm just going to add, just for a little texture, just a few hatchings every once in a while to give it the texture of that block. However, not too much, because it's very light compared to everything else. Okay, and so this would be another step with another texture. If you don't do it exactly the same way as is on the picture, that's just fine. Remember, we're not going to see this picture later. We're only going to see your drawing. This block is much larger over here. So this is just another technique. It's just a simple little hatch. Okay, so we have hatching, cross hatching. We showed stippling over here. And then finally, I'm going to do just a little bit of these flowers because this is a random scribble too. Notice some of the flowers here are white and everything around it is a little darker. So what I'd started doing is just kind of putting in, remember you're not going to see your picture later, so I'm just putting in a random flower and then starting to go darker around it. Maybe there's a leaf here and putting that shadow under the leaf, and then kind of coloring in the leaf itself so that the flower will be lighter. So organic things like bushes and flowers and stuff like that, you can be much more random with. Put in some really dark and some really light just to build this up. Okay. The pillar, notice I kept it white, but it had a shadow on the left side, so this has tiny, tiny little lines. And up here is much lighter, so that just has a few stipples. So making sure that we have that contrast between that light and the dark. Make sure you get in at least 3 different techniques. So this was my crosshatch, this was my hatch, scribble, which was also a different type of scribble here, and then this is stippling with maybe a little bit of hot hatching with it. Okay, so just some thoughts on how to do this. Everyone's is going to be a little bit different, but once again, keeping some white and keeping some dark.